Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Let me ask you a quick question right out of the gate. Is climate change just an environmental disaster, or is it actually, fundamentally, the ultimate economic failure? Today, we're going to look right past the political rhetoric and dig into the rigorous, honestly fascinating economics behind carbon trading and taxation. We're going to treat this like a masterclass in market mechanics. We'll break down exactly how pricing the planet's future might literally be the most powerful tool we have to save it. So, let's dive right in.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We'll be covering the ultimate market failure, global emissions and pressure, creating a missing market, cap and trade mechanics, the carbon tax alternative, and finally, will markets save us?
All right, part one, the ultimate market failure.
I want you to consider this really provocative question for a second. Is climate change the biggest market failure the world has ever seen? Because before we can even attempt to fix a problem as massive as this, we absolutely have to accurately diagnose it. And in economics, that means identifying exactly where the system broke down. You know, it's so easy to look at a smokestack and just see an environmental tragedy. But through an economic lens, that smokestack represents a profound failure of market logic. The market, which is usually so incredibly good at allocating resources, has completely failed to account for the true cost of doing business. But why is that?
Well, the answer lies in this fundamental concept: negative externalities. A negative externality happens when the costs of an economic transaction are suffered by a third party who had absolutely no say in that transaction. Think about it. When a factory burns coal to produce electricity, the factory owner and the buyer agree on a price for that power, right? But the pollution, the carbon dioxide pumped into the atmosphere, is a massive cost borne by society as a whole, not by the polluter. The market fails because it just entirely ignores this hidden cost.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how that failure happens on a mathematical level. Consider this comparison. On one side, we've got the marginal private cost. This is just the standard cost of supply for the business, what they pay for raw materials and labor. But on the other side, we have the marginal social cost. Now, this includes that private cost plus the cost of the negative externality, the pollution. When a market only prices private output and completely ignores that much higher actual marginal social cost, we don't just get pollution, we get a massive efficiency loss. The market basically ends up overproducing goods that harm society because the true price of production is artificially cheap.
Moving on to Section 2, global emissions and pressure.
When we map out the global carbon dilemma, a pretty stark contrast emerges. If you look at the vertical axis, representing emissions in tons of carbon per capita, you'll see the United States towering over the rest. That indicates the highest per capita emissions in the world. But now, check out the horizontal axis, which represents population in millions. Notice those massive wide blocks for China and India? While their per capita emissions might be lower, their staggering populations mean their total contribution is absolutely enormous. This really visualizes the intense, compounding global pressure we're facing right now. High consumption in the West is colliding with massive, rapidly developing populations in Asia.
Which brings us to Section 3, creating a missing market. So, if the global pressure is rising, and the core issue is that the market is failing to price pollution, what exactly is the economic solution? Well, if a market is missing, we literally have to invent it. This core concept reveals the absolute academic genius behind carbon trading. Market failure occurs precisely because there is a missing market. Historically, nobody owned the atmosphere, right? So there were no environmental property rights to trade or enforce. Carbon trading seeks to fix this by artificially creating those exact property rights. By assigning concrete, tradable rights to pollution, governments generate the precise financial incentives needed to reduce it. We're essentially slapping a price tag on the atmosphere.
All right, Section 4, cap and trade mechanics.
But how does that actually work in reality? Here is the chronological, step-by-step logic of how a cap-and-trade system physically operates. Step 1. The governing body sets a strict cap on the total amount of emissions allowed. Step 2 is absolutely crucial. This cap artificially forces scarcity into the market. Remember your basic economics. Without scarcity, there is zero value. The cap provides the mathematical scarcity required to generate a real market price for carbon. And finally, Step 3. At the end of each year, installations have to reconcile. They are required to prove they hold enough allowances to cover their actual measured emissions for that year.
Of course, an artificial market is completely useless without strict enforcement. If a business emits more carbon than they have allowances for, they face severe financial consequences.
For example, in Phase 2 of the European system, the penalty for excess emissions rose to a staggering €100 per ton of CO2. That ensures that ignoring the cap is financially ruinous. It literally gives the market the teeth it needs to function.
And here is where the magic of the market truly takes over. Let's juxtapose the two business perspectives under cap and trade. On the asset side, if a highly efficient company reduces its emissions below its allowance, it can sell its surplus on the open market for a straight profit. They are financially rewarded for being green. On the liability side, a heavily polluting company facing high costs to reduce emissions must buy those extra allowances. So the crucial takeaway here is that this system naturally discovers the absolute cheapest ways to implement cutbacks across the whole economy. As the market price of carbon inevitably rises, it creates a massive, long-term incentive for businesses to invest heavily in clean, pollution-efficient technologies.
Now let's look at Section 5, the carbon tax alternative. Because cap and trade isn't the only tool in the economist's toolkit, let's shift gears and systematically evaluate the primary competing alternative. A carbon tax is defined very simply as a specific tax applied to the consumption of goods that cause CO2 emissions. Think of it this way. While cap and trade strictly controls the quantity of emissions and lets the market dictate the price, a carbon tax strictly controls the price of emissions and lets the market dictate the resulting quantity. It's a much more direct, kind of blunt instrument.
Let's lay out the robust academic case for the carbon tax. First up, it mandates a specific price. This drastically reduces financial uncertainty for businesses. They know exactly what a ton of carbon will cost them 5 years from now, which makes long-term planning way easier. Second, it perfectly internalizes those negative externalities we talked about earlier. By raising the marginal cost of emitting up to the point where the social cost equals the social benefit, the market literally corrects itself. Furthermore, behavioral economics tells us that consumers will respond to these price changes, sometimes in really surprising, innovative ways. And finally, the revenue generated by this tax isn't just lost to the void. It can be ring-fenced, meaning strictly set aside, and recycled directly into funding green environmental initiatives.
Which leads us to our final section, Section 6, Will Markets Save Us?
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, from diagnosing the root market failure to engineering structural, real-world solutions. So I want to leave you with this vital thought to ponder. Can carbon markets truly be part of the answer in controlling climate change? We know for sure that the era of free pollution has to end, and that properly pricing negative externalities is just an existential requirement at this point. But whether society will ultimately embrace the dynamic price discovery of cap and trade or the strict certainty of a carbon tax, well, that remains to be seen. The market brought us into this mess by completely ignoring the cost of carbon. Will a meticulously structured market be exactly what gets us out of it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.